So we have on the line with us, I believe we have Star Parker. She is joining us by phone. I want to show you before she gets on with us. She has this great book out. And if you were listening to the show, I actually think it was June 1st, the last time Star was on with us, which happened to be the first day of June. Today's the last day of June. Anyway, she mentioned her book at that time, her latest book. She's a wonderful author. This is her latest book called Necessary Noise, and the subtitle is How Donald Trump Inflames the Culture War and Why This is Good News for America. Star Parker, founder of CURE, based in Washington, D.C., the Center for Urban Renewal and Education. She's a brilliant, long-time advocate in Washington for conservative policies to lift all of America up. CURE is, you can find CURE, the organization, CURE at urbancure.org. And Star is their founder and leads that organization today. And I believe we have Star online. Hi, Star. So we lost the connection, maybe. Okay. We had this setup connection issue. Okay, we before she came on, before the show started today, we were talking. I was losing her a little bit. So I think Matt the Wonderful is going to try to figure out what's going on there. In the meantime, I'll tell you, Star is someone who has written numerous books. Last time she was on, I went through the whole litany. We got her now. Okay. Hi, Star.
Yes, I'm here.
I'm so glad you're here. Hi. Well, I was very glad you could join us today. I showed our listeners your book, Necessary Noise, and the subtitle, How Donald Trump Inflames the Culture War and Why This is Good News for America. I was going to close with this question, but I'll just throw it out there now and then come back to it later. I don't know how much more good news we can take with Donald Trump inflaming or the culture war. This has been quite the ride for the last few years. But tell us about your premise in this book, Necessary Noise, what you're talking about.
Well, it has been a bumpy ride, but in my book I talk about the bumpiness right before the Civil War. I think that we're at a critical cross point in our country, similar to where we were in the 1850s when Abraham Lincoln knew we could not go on anymore, half free and half slave. We had to make a decision. When he looked into the scriptures and read the words of red, meaning Jesus' own words that said a house divided against itself cannot stand, he came up out of that scriptural moment and said, we can no longer be both. We're going to have to make a decision. And I think that what we're finding in the Trump presidency from the moment he was inaugurated until now is that we're at that same point, that we have to make a decision as a society, a civil society. Are we going to be biblical and free, or are we going to be secular and status? Are we going to allow the tyranny and the totalitarian demands that we're seeing in the streets today be the reality for America in its future? That's basically what the book is about. Now, I wrote it almost 2 years ago, and it was released in November, right when we were in the middle of impeachment. Things were getting very dark and loud then. We had just come out of the whole Russia gate, and then we went into a time of quiet for one moment, and the next thing we knew we had COVID, and now we're in racial unrest. So that noise is going to get louder. We battle in the voting booth. Let's hope that this year we will end up battling once again in the voting booth. But I'm really not sure. If there is anything that Joe Biden has said that's coherent, is that this next election is about the soul of America. And if what we've been seeing on the news and what we're seeing in Seattle and what we're seeing right here in our nation's capital is not a sign of, to everyone, of a sign of fear, that what is at stake is the soul of America, then I don't know what will wake them up. Do I think the noise is necessary? I absolutely do. Can we relate it to even some of the Supreme Court decisions that you just mentioned? We absolutely can. Abortion is an illusion. It is a crime against humanity, and it feeds a narrative that people do not have to be responsible with their choices, and it is now in the streets of our society. The good news is that the court also ruled on Espinosa, as you also mentioned. Our nation's future lies in that Espinosa case, because now we have an opportunity for money to follow children to schools parents want, including schools where you're going to learn about the beauty and principles of Christianity, of capitalism, and of our Constitution, so that that next generation will be prepared to keep this country free.
Yes, that Espinosa decision, the one I mentioned, that is where the law came from the state of Montana. Blaine amendments had been kind of a trend in the country, where states would say they would let money go to some private schools, but not religious schools. I love that the Supreme Court was very strong on that. It's a great decision. And it is a decision which I think ties into among the many things that Urban Cure, your organization, does so well, which is advocate for school choice, advocate for the way to bring change to communities of color, low-income communities around this country. To bring change is to allow school choice. So I want to make sure to your point. I'm making your point clear, understanding your point clearly. This decision in Espinosa is really enabling school choice to expand, right?
It is a game changer. When you start thinking about what this means to overturn all 40 Blaine amendments in one sweep, we have been fighting for this moment as long as I've been in this battle, which is 25 years. But even prior to that, where money would follow children to schools parents want, in particular when you're talking about those that are most disenfranchised and those that are in our most desperate and deplorable communities. They need a fighting chance. Family life has broken down. The only place we get them is in that classroom. And what we've done as a society is allowed for the government to fund union-controlled classrooms, and the students have been indoctrinated in a worldview to hate this country, in a worldview that America is inherently evil and therefore it must be overthrown. And that's who are in the street today, these 20-year-olds. What we need is a new generation that understands the beauty of America, that this country is good. So yes, this is a critical decision, including and especially for those that are hit hardest by life in our great country. When you think about the difference between Michael Brown, who we all know his name from Ferguson, some say suicide by cop, because most people will not run up on a police officer with a gun without then having the fruit of that gun in their heart, and Simone Biles, who many people know brought us home the gold. Some say the most fantastic gymnast in the history of the world. Well, what is the difference in their educational life? In their family life, they both came from horrible brokenness. They were both at the place that we study here in Washington statistically. But Michael Brown went to a government school. Michael Brown lived in a community to where they had a Blaine Amendment, so he could not get out of that school, even if his mother wanted him out of that school, so that we could put a virtue and a worldview in him that would counter all of the mishaps that he was born into, as opposed to Simone Biles, who, when she was adopted up by her grandfather, they put her in a Catholic school where she learned traditions. Then they homeschooled her. The difference in her life, the only place that we as a civil society get other people's children to help them shape themselves to become healthy adults, is in that classroom. So Espinosa is giving us that opportunity now, where money can follow children to schools parents want. So I see over the next 5 years a revolution in some of our most hard-hit communities as we start seeing the movement of these poor students going into Christian schools where they can learn about healthy patterns and civility.
That is beautiful. I could not agree more. Your book, I wanted to mention for our listeners, because I do want to have a bunch of questions I want to go to, but your book, Necessary Noise, How Donald Trump Inflames a Culture War and Why This is Good News for America, you hit on so many topics in which you kind of lay out where America was after 8 years under President Obama, and then what President Trump inherited, what he had to deal with. And one of the wonderful traits about President Trump, and we saw it in the campaign, and I was very nervous about him during the primary. I thought that his presence in the primary and even in Washington might be disruptive and maybe even dangerous to America. But I've come to so deeply appreciate him and his bravery and his clarity on many, many issues. You mentioned, for one thing, that President Trump had misunderstood the dangers of multiculturalism, and also and he discussed how American exceptionalism was important, and this just unnerved the diversity clan, to use your term. It's been a wonderful thing. Yeah, I'd love to have you comment about why you found that to be important to mention.
Well, what I did was looked at 5 areas where we see a lot of noise. We hear a lot of noise, and it has been going on for a long time. So I make the case that, God, it says that the heart of man is in his hand, and he turns it the way he wants to. And we were at a moment in our history where we couldn't go on anymore as we were. So he needed a disruptor in the White House. We needed to confront ourselves and who we are as a as a nation. I mean, 60 million abortions. This is just not good for a society to survive. When you think about redefining marriage, so I look at 5 areas. I look at the swamp noise, why we have not been able to get anything done here in Washington, D.C. I look at the tolerance noise where you're talking now, multiculturalism. You hear the Democrats saying now that, racism is systemic and that's why we have police brutality. Any systemic racism that we do have or we can identify are rooted in this whole messaging of multiculturalism, inclusivism, and diversity that they have put into every one of our institutions to where we now have to go around looking for race behind every face. So I talk about that quite extensively. I talk about the tolerance noise that we're constantly hearing from these youth who think they know so much more than every generation before them, that we are going to succumb to their worldview or they're going to terrorize us. I talk about the gender noise and what is happening there with this LGBTQ community, to where biblical people cannot even voice their freedom to the First Amendment, to expression of their religion. And then I talk, of course, about the black noise and how this Black Lives Matters is rooted in totalitarianism. If anyone wants to know what Black Lives Matters means, you can go to their own website and they will tell you that they believe even traditions like conjugal marriage, where a husband is married to the mother of the children, is Western civilization, and so therefore it's racism in its very being. And then I talk about opportunity noise, what we can have if we make sure that in this 2020 election we vote for values, we vote for the mercy that God extended when he gave us Donald Trump. A lot of Christians know the difference between grace and mercy. Grace is not getting is getting what you don't deserve, but mercy is not getting what you do deserve. When you think about grace, getting the blessings of freedom, but mercy, we deserved death as a society because we've let all of our institutions be corrupted from our founding. The founding principles are solid and clear, principles of Christianity and capitalism and our Constitution, and all of this has been disrupted, including in our schools. So therefore, we have a second opportunity to turn things around. Our first reborn was in the Civil War. Our second reborn is in 2020 election.
I love that idea. And actually, I was going to run through you have your book divided in 5 parts. You just mentioned swamp noise, tolerance noise, gender noise, black noise, and opportunity noise. Many, many good points you make, and many dipping back into history, explaining how we got here, where we are now. I want to commend you just for how deeply thoughtful this book is, and how it takes beyond just a political R versus D, left versus right, conservative or liberal, and it's really a very rooted in the ideas of the founding of America, rooted in the notions of the Judeo-Christian ideas that shaped the idea of America to start with, and then how those got carried forward and how we kind of lost our way in them. And so we are watching, as you say, we're just watching the outpouring of opposition to all the greatness that America is, because we've had a generation or more of people who never learned it, never understood it, got told just the opposite, actually, when they were in school about America's greatness. And it's so I just can't commend you strongly enough. You even make reference in here. I was going to dive in a little bit on the you have no police, no peace. And I noticed that obviously it's a huge issue in America today, the allegations. I mean, police brutality obviously exists. We have problems sometimes with police. We've got to try to correct them. But the movement now from the Black Lives Matter, very Marxist-oriented mindset, is to defund, and eventually in some places talking about replace the police, that defund them, come up with other people, other entities that will somehow replace the police. And in New York City, just this morning, they announced a $1 billion, B as in boy, $1 billion cut to the budget, the police department budget in New York City. What's your sense of how that will impact the black community in America?
Well, I think it's an eye-opener for African Americans that are in the middle class to see how quickly one discussion about police brutality can move to talk about overthrow in America. I don't believe that most middle-class African Americans buy that idea. And what they're now hearing is that any police brutality that we do see is connected to union influence to protect bad cops. So this is a turning point, I believe, for many that are overseers of these smaller communities and even our larger cities to say, hey, wait a minute, perhaps we should rethink that if we have no police, we don't have peace. And we can see it very loudly, not just here at what they're calling now Black Lives Matters Plaza, but also up in Seattle. The duplication of what they've done to our nation's capital, which is totally destroyed at this moment. But when you talk about community policing, which is what most African Americans say that they want, then you cannot have union contracts that are in violation of that say that police officers cannot live in the communities that they are to safeguard, that they are to serve. So I think that this is a good moment. You know, in the Chinese symbol of crises, it has two things, danger and opportunity. So while it is extremely dangerous, this noise that we're hearing, and it will get worse going into November, but it's also a good opportunity for us to make the case for a rule of law. It is a great opportunity for us to talk about those founding principles that, no, they did not learn in their schools. That's the problem. For the last two generations, they've not heard anything beautiful about the founding of the country and why it works for anyone from any background or any ethnicity, and why so many want to be here, because they've been governed and ruled by this leftist mentality, as you're calling, of Marxism. So, you know, while things are pretty dark, and I'm actually living in a food desert out here, as they call them in Washington, because they destroyed any and all opportunities for us to get any type of everyday product. It is also a good opportunity for us to have these deeper discussions that have needed to take place for quite some time.
Star, I thought of you in an article I read this morning. This was Lieutenant General Michael Flynn actually had a piece out, when he has this statement he makes. I was once told, if we're not careful, 2% of the passionate will control 98% of the indifferent 100% of the time. And I thought of you in this book because we are watching in the current situation with riots and destruction of property and arson, the violence you and I talked about back on June 1st. And we're watching kind of culturally, it seems like we've seen more of the advocates on the far left, Marxist, angry, anti-American, denigrating the ideas of America, denigrating the Christian faith, denigrating the very structure of our country and Judeo-Christian values. The critics have been loud and persistent, and they have been persuasive. And I think his point is well taken. If the rest of the 98% of us sit back and say, either are indifferent or don't want to offend, don't want to speak up, the loud, the squeaky wheel, so to speak, the loud protesters win. So your book is really a tremendous kind of speaking up for the 98% who actually love this country, love the ideas of this country. And I wonder if you want to comment on that concept that really the squeaky, loud voices seem to get response until the rest of us speak up.
Well, I agree with you, and I appreciate that you see the significant role that my book has in this discussion that we're having. And for anyone that wants the language of what they need to say, all that say, well, I don't know what to say, even to their own children, and why their own children are out there protesting and putting themselves at risk for not just COVID, but to be killed because some have an agenda behind this lawlessness that we're seeing. But we have to ask ourselves that with elected officials, where are they? Where is anyone standing with what the president needed to do to walk over to St. John's Church with a Bible and say enough of this? We're a country of rules. And I believe that without that outcry from those that we have elected and people that are in power, that is one of the reasons that we're now seeing the pulling down of statues, because people left the president by himself to go over there and declare that this is a country, a rule of law. Law is rooted in truth, and truth is rooted in God. He didn't say that, but that's what he was saying, holding up the Bible. But you didn't see of the masses of those that are here in the swamp coming to his defense. And so their next move was to take him on, and now they're all over the country pulling down statues and just absolute craziness behind the damage that they're doing to our great country. So I'm still waiting for not just the silent majority to stand up and say something and have the tools to know what to say, but I'm looking for these so-called leaders in the Republican Party to stand up and put an end to this and tell these little suburban white kids that are wreaking havoc over this country to go home. They need to go home. Colleges are closed. There was no reason for them to go out into the streets and protest. In fact, everyone that bought into this, well, they had a right. No, they did not.
Right.
Everyone around the world was appalled by what we saw in that video. So therefore, we knew justice would be done. We are not in the 1950s. And for them to have been able to narrate it out, and you had people of goodwill and good meaning to narrate with them that, well, you know, they're a little angry and they just need to go out and vent. No, your grief is your own. You go inside and you write a poem. You don't go into the streets and destroy other people's property. So we're in war. We're in war. But the president, Donald Trump, stopped the arms war when he walked across Lafayette Park and held up his Bible. They are still here. They're still damaging here in Washington, D.C., but it would be really nice if we could find one or two politicians to get up and say, he was absolutely right, and they join together. Perhaps they should join together arm in arm around the Capitol and say, enough of this lawlessness. Go home, you lousy little spoiled, rotten brats. And we're hoping that your colleges do not reopen so that they cannot continue this dialogue inside of these Ivy League towers while they're using the backs of those that are most vulnerable, most poor, and are devastated by the damage that they've done through their so-called Black Lives Matters campaign.
Star, I'm almost speechless. First of all, I couldn't agree with you more. Love, love, love everything you just said. And actually, this is a point I've been making in my show throughout this time period when we're watching the riots and destruction, the statues pulling down. What leftists would like more than anything is to have America think that we are in a race war, that all of this is about one race versus another race. And actually, many people are pointing out, myself included, that the Marxist ideas behind the Black Lives Matter movement, the Marxist idea that are pushing Antifa, these are being led by extreme radical leftist white intellectuals. It is not a race war. It is a battle of ideas, holding on to the idea of America, the goodness and greatness of America, or letting it be destroyed. And unfortunately, the white, extreme leftists, Marxist, socialist, communist, whatever category they want to claim they are, those people stirring up America into division and inspiring young people to do things, which I think if you ask some of the protesters, they don't even know why they would think about tearing down a statue. But there's an agitation behind it that is really where the battle is. The battle is about, are we going to have America as founded, or as you put it in at the beginning of your book, America as founded, a society that's biblical and free, or a society secular and statist. Love it. Love your book. I do want to give you a quick chance. Star, you have a new podcast. Can you tell our listeners about your podcast?
Well, it's actually it's a live TV show. It's an hour, so it's not a podcast. It's live, and it's cureamerica.news is where you'll find it, urbancure.org or cureamerica.news. But it's a weekly news talk show directed specifically toward that silent majority, that 100 million that still got them go to church on Sunday morning. I want them to understand what's at stake. The left is using race to divide and conquer, and they will conquer if we do not stand up. And we will have a tomorrow of America that will not look like America. It will be as a third world country with dictators in charge, and we will then have our grandchildren have to fight to get back to our founding principles of Christianity, of capitalism, and of our Constitution.
And on that note, Star Parker, love having you every time I get to pleasure have you on. I love it. You can find Star Parker on Twitter at Star Parker, her website, urbancure.org, her book, Necessary Noise. You got to get it. It's actually really a fun read. You can see all the little stickies sticking out the side. This is all the questions I wanted to ask, didn't get to. But Star Parker, great, great book. Thank you so much for joining me today.
You're welcome, Debbie. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, folks, that book is great. Give it to your liberal friends. Give it to your liberal friends. It'd be a great gift, a July 4th gift. Get it for them this week. Order from Amazon and send it to your friends as a July 4th gift. Fabulous discussion about the big issues facing America.